The Biophilic Leadership Summit is the only multi-day conference entirely dedicated to biophilic projects, principles, and research, bringing together the top industry leaders in an intimate, natural setting to network, build partnerships, and learn from each other.
This year's summit will explore biophilic placemaking and how we can use biophilic principles to promote health, happiness, and vitality in public spaces.
In addition to fascinating presentations, delicious farm-to-table meals at Serenbe, and cocktails, this year's summit will feature a selection of biophilic experiences like forest bathing, bird watching, and more.
So join us in Serenbe for the 6th Annual Biophilic Leadership Summit from March 24th to March 26th, 2024.
Learn more about the summit and register today at biophilic.summit.com.
That's biophilic.summit.com. We hope to see you there.
Hi, I'm Monica Olson.
And I'm Jennifer Walsh.
And you're listening to the Biophilic Solutions podcast, where every other week we sit down with experts and thought leaders across industries in order to explore the innate connection between humans and nature and why we need nature to thrive.
We truly believe that in order to tackle the global environmental problems we're facing, we as humans must reconnect to the natural world and come to a better understanding of how we fit in and how we are so interconnected. So in every episode, we'll interview new guests that help us uncover and highlight nature-based solutions to get us on a path to greater health, tackling climate change, and ultimately getting outside and connecting with nature.
So let's get to today's episode. Hey, Jennifer.
Hey, Monica.
So Jen, we are coming down from a whirlwind few weeks here with the summit behind us.
Oh my gosh, that was wild.
So this week's episode is a presentation from the Biophilic Leadership Summit with Bill Browning while he was here at Serenbe. This is very different from our last episode, which was a live interview at FIT's Sustainability Conference.
Yes, and I had the best time at the summit.
You know, it was so great seeing you in person and being back in person with everybody at the summit, getting to hear from everybody who was there, incredible industry leaders, as well as all their impactful work. Plus, of course, I always say the networking.
The networking was off the charts.
Yeah.
Okay, so the lineup included many former podcast interviews, like Dr. Anjan Chatterjee, who I interviewed, Phil Tabb, Fred Dest, and Alfie Vick. And I'll add we're planning to interview more presenters down the line, so definitely stay tuned. We've barely scratched the surface of the amazing people in this biophilic movement.
Definitely. So today we're excited to share Bill Browning's presentation about the biophilic response to wood. You know, we've spoken to Bill on the podcast before about biophilic patterns, but here he uses some of those patterns to talk in detail about wood and really thinking about how we use it in architecture and design.
Yes, and without giving anything away, the thing that intrigued Bill about wood is what we seem to have a particularly strong emotional response to it. So Bill is digging deeper to understand why that is, and that's exactly what you're about to hear more about today.
And I'm sure our listeners will want to know more about this. So before we dive in, I want to point out that the Nature of Wood white paper from Bill is the first item in our show notes. So if you want to download that, read it before or read it after, its presentation is based on everything he's talking about, expands on his ideas. And with that, let's take it away.
People have a different response to wood than almost any other material. And I can't think of a rational reason why that should be, right? Why should I like wood more than metal or plastic or stone or concrete? Or why is there this response to wood? And David said, let's take a look. Let's go explore what it is about this stuff. And so with the support from Forestry Innovation Investment and Softwood Lumber Board, two industry groups from the US and Canada, they allowed us to do a dive and really geek out in the science. And so we just sort of started asking this question. Now, I want to preface this with, there's been a lot of work about wood starting back in the 1970s. All this work on what's a preferred material? How do people respond, and do people like different materials in their spaces? And there's lots of studies that indicate a really strong preference for having wood as a material around you. And even some of them are looking at how much wood and how do people respond to it. And so a lot of this research is in Japan. You see some in Scandinavia. There's also work on what's the color of wood that people like. Do they like knots in the wood? Do they like it all grain and no knots? Or, all of that sort of stuff. There's all kinds of stuff around that. And you can find lots of paper on that. Lots of papers on that. And it's fun reading. It's a little obscure sometimes, but it's fun reading. But no one ever explains why. And so we wanted to kind of ask that question. And so what's this response to wood? And there are these things that even look at having this much wood affects creativity or affects blood pressure, right? Or all these sorts of things like that. But we kind of couldn't find what's the mechanism, what's leading to some of these responses. Some of it's going back to digging around the biophilia hypothesis and basic work around biophilia and connection to nature, and how do we have these different experiences of nature. So when you start the conversation about wood, inevitably people will bring up forest bathing and all of the work going on in Japan and Korea around forest bathing. And it's really intriguing work, and it's getting better and better. I mean, some of the early stuff was great, but the data sets were a little small to do analysis. Now they're doing experiments with much bigger data sets, and you're really getting interesting information. And that exposure to being in these forests, which are typically hinoki plantations. So hinoki is a Japanese wood, and a lot of the work is going on in hinoki plantations in Korea. And some of the interesting stuff they're doing is around blood pressure and heart rate, cortisol levels. For us, some of the early stuff around forest bathing that I really loved was not just that, oh, surprise, you go for a walk in wood and experience this, and then you come back in an urban setting, and you can see a difference in the cortisol level. But for us, one of the more intriguing things was the persistence of that impact. Well, it wasn't just, okay, so as soon as you get out of that environment, everything clicks back and you are back to stress state. You would see lowered cortisol levels lasting for multiple hours after the forest exposure. And so there was some persistence with even just a 15-minute exposure. You could see some persistence with that effect. There was also this work on T-cell and immune responses, which seems to be tied to some of the terpenes, some of the chemical compounds that the trees are releasing. And if you think about it, hinoki has a really distinct, very strong smell. It's really pleasing, and it's been used, it's one of the reasons why it's been used for gift boxes and special furniture and also paneling spaces in Japan and other parts of Asia for generations. And so it may be something related to that. But, the forest bathing, you're seeing living trees. It's not this. Right? So it was like, okay, so forest bathing doesn't answer the question for us. So let's then go through the different ways that we might experience wood, and also look at some of the other studies related to biophilia in trees. So this was an interesting study looking at tree canopy around homes, around transit to school, and in schoolyards, involving about 2,600 kids grades 2 through 4 in Barcelona. And they found that what they were looking at was, in those grades, you have a fairly well-known progression of cognitive development. The brain is, little kids' brain is developing, and you have a fairly good data set on what you should expect from that. And what they found, separate from demographics, was those schoolyards that had more tree canopy, the kids had increased cognitive development. I'm suspecting some of that may be due to both not only the trees, but actually when you're under those trees, you get these really amazing statistical fractals of the dappled light pattern. And we know that that has really good stress reduction characteristics. So if we start digging into the senses, so first let's talk about thermal response, in particular thermal response on the body. So if you want to dig into that topic, there's a field called alesthesia, which is looking at differential thermal response over different parts of the body. And so kind of one of the best ways to explain that is, what's the thermally most sensitive place on your body? All right, where do you check the temperature of a baby's bottle? That's the most thermally sensitive place on the body. And in fact, if I want to cool you off or warm your body, not only do I have the sensory, the nerve endings there, but also that vein goes straight back into the heart on a very short route. And so if I want to cool you off or cool you down, I'll do that with just cooling off your wrist or heating up your wrist. And so in fact, the military has developed for soldiers these gloves that do that for them to help them survive in extreme environments. And what we do know is that, because of the cellular structure and the thermal conductance of wood, this, right, touch the back of your chair and then touch the surface of the table in front of you. They feel different, right? They're exactly the same temperature, but they have different conductance. They have different conductance, right? This perceives warm because it has less thermal conductance than this metal. All right, so we thought, okay, that's interesting. There's something related to wood. But a lot of the stuff on why people love wood and response to wood, you're not touching the wood. And the wood grain is interesting as well, the texture of wood grain, but we don't think that's probably not why we have this response to wood. So let's look at the olfactory response, the smell of wood. And I'll admit, I for a very long time thought that aromatherapy was complete hogwash. And now we're starting to see some evidence that there's something interesting going on here. And I'm going to give you two examples. These are studies that you kind of would, when you first read them, you read the paper and go, who thought this one up? So the first one was looking at linalool. And linalool is a predominant compound in the scent of lavender. So this was work with mice, and they found that exposing them to that scent triggered the same neural pathways as Valium. So when people say that lavender reduces stress or anxiety, well, that's exactly because those neural pathways that are used by Valium. But unlike Valium, you don't get habituated to it. So that was one. And then, while we were doing some of this research, this paper comes out in 2021. And this was one of those days when you read it, it's like, wow, or this was some really interesting thinking. So limonene is one of the terpenes. It's related to citrus, but you frequently find it in coniferous trees, in pines. And one of the places you'll smell it the most is a species of pine called stone pines. And for centuries in Bavaria and Austria and Switzerland, this tree has been used for making beds. If you're going to make a bed, you make it from this tree. And a lot of times you'll even see, just in the bedroom, you'll see wainscoting made from this wood. And it has a really distinct, pleasant smell to it. And so the question of this study was, does that translate into a measurable impact? And so here's where the study gets wild. So they created a separation chamber, and they put a bed of stone pine in it, and have people sleep in that bed for extended periods of time, for multiple nights, while they are measuring their cardiorespiratory responses. So they gather all that data, and then they replicate the study where you sleep in a bed that looks exactly like that bed but it's not made from stone pine. It's made from a composite with a plastic laminate on the outside. It looks exactly like that bed, but it's not stone pine, and you don't have the limonene. And lo and behold, there's a significant difference in cardiorespiratory response between sleeping in those two beds. And so that has to be an olfactory response, because you think about it. I'm asleep. I can't see the bed. It's not a haptic response because I'm touching the sheets. I'm not touching the wood of the bed. It's got to be the smell of the bed itself. So, okay, so maybe it's that, but then we sort of step back and go, yeah, but a lot of times I can't smell a discernible scent from wood, or as wood ages, it loses that scent. So that's interesting and powerful, and it's a great response, but that's probably it's not driving it. So there was some earlier discussion about semantic processing yesterday. And so one of our neuroscientist friends said, well, there may be some semantic processing going on here. And it's literally the brain going, wood, tree, alive. Right? That's literally the steps happening. And you can kind of see this play out. If you ask someone, what is wood? And they'll say, it's a natural material, right? That's subconsciously that process playing out. Okay, that's interesting. But what else is going on with wood? So when we were looking at some of the other science, and particularly some work, we've gotten to work with Tom Albright, a neuroscientist who's got a team, and particularly is doing a lot of work on visual processing at Salk Institute. And one of the things they've learned is, particularly in nature, you see a lot of these patterns that are collinear. They're not exactly parallel, but they're collinear. And so here's another Fay Jones chapel. We saw Thorncrown earlier, here's another one. You'll notice that all these lines moving in the same direction. So it turns out that if I have a set of lines going like this, it's one set of neurons that processes that. That is a different set of neurons. That is a different set of neurons. So I have an environment where I've got a whole bunch of lines running in the same direction, roughly. It's much easier for the brain to process. And so you see an almost instantaneous drop in galvanic skin response. It lowers our stress. What is wood grain? Look at the table in front of you. What's that pattern that we're seeing? Oh, look, it's really, really collinear. And so we think that may be one of the strongest drivers on that. You also see nested fractal patterns, right? So you'll see, when you see the kind of oval shapes in the grain that are layered, multiple layers of iterations of the same. It's not exactly the same. It's not a regular fractal, it's a statistical fractal, but that's a fractal as well. And fractals elicit a really interesting response. They occur so frequently within nature that we have a predilection to, when we see them in human-designed objects or human materials, we'll exhibit a very strong preference for them, and they seem to reduce our stress as well. And so the term that Hager Hall and Richard Taylor and a bunch of other researchers use is fractal fluency. The brain is fluent with these kinds of patterns, and they seem to occur in wood as well. And so within the context of 15 patterns of biophilic design, wood kind of falls into several of these, in particular, material connection nature, natural materials, but also the biomorphic forms and the complexity and order. So some examples of its use in environments. This is a space designed by a friend of ours, Oliver Heath, in the UK. It's at a public school in Hackney, and a public school with a fair population of kids on the autism spectrum. And it has a strongly nature-based playground outside But there's so much activity out there that it is way overstimulating for those kids on the spectrum. And so they wanted to create a space where those kids could take a pause whenever they felt they needed to, get away and separate. And so they created this space that has these wood cubby holes that the kids can duck into. It has interface carpet tiles with a strongly biomorphic pattern to them. It has the image of the forest there, and then it has these wood columns that have natural materials in them, like rocks or bark or other things that kids can use to play with and get a controllable level of stimulation. And so this is an example we like quite a bit. This is an olfactory one. This is a pop-up store for Valextra, which makes luxury leather goods, handbags. This was in Milan. It was designed by King Akuma. It's these beautiful live edge slabs of wood. So you see the wood grain, and you know that those were very much trees. But when you read about the results and you hear about the results of the space, what they didn't expect was that during the whole period that this was up, you could smell the limonene. You could smell the terpenes of the wood, and that's what people, you asked, we saw articles about it where people said what they remembered most about the store was how wonderful it smelled, the smell. Wood also has this capability to do, age and patina over time, and that's something that we're really interested in from a sustainability standpoint of, can I produce an environment that doesn't have to be changed constantly and renewed constantly? And in hospitality, which is one of the hardest environments because stuff gets really beat up, the frequent cycle is usually around 7 years to replace everything in a room and all of that. So this is a spa done on Kiwa Ion, designed by Clota, that when this picture was taken, this space was 18 years old, and people loved the space so much, and it had patinaed in such a way that they had not done any renovations. It's still, right, it went for more than 20 years before they made any renovations within that spa space. Here you can see that strong collinear pattern which is also a play on biomorphic forms, and this is the central hall of the main public library in Calgary with these beautiful sweeping western red cedar lined stairwells. This is a combination of real and simulated wood in this hospital setting. And so this is a prototype for us that then got built at a hospital in La Jolla. So this is done by Canon Design. And they have some pretty good post-occupancy data on people's response to being in this wood, in this room, surrounded by these patterns, and being able to lay in your bed, see outside, but also see these surfaces. And then this is one of our favorites. This is a mass timber structure that it was completed in 2020 by Heatherwick. In the UK, in the national healthcare system, when you get a diagnosis, you're handed your diagnosis that you have cancer, they're kind of like, okay, then we'll see you again in whatever period for the next steps and all that. And people kind of walk out the door with absolutely shattering news. And so there's a nonprofit that has built a number of these centers around the major hospitals in the UK, where you go in and you receive counseling and you get information on your drug regime and you get introduced to support groups and networking. And so this one was designed by Heatherwick. It is 3 structures that are made of mass timber that are like trees. And there are private spaces, meeting rooms inside the tree trunks. And then there's this sort of mystery condition of these fun mixed public spaces on multiple levels in between the tree trunks. And then all this extraordinary planting on the site and on the roof of all of this structure. It is designed so that this building will patina and show age. And there's a really distinct strategy for doing that. If you have people who are worried about am I going to be around? Putting them in a facility that says, we're going to be here. This is going to age. This building is going to show age. These niches for art and places for art installations, that art is all stuff being generated by patients who've come through that center, patients of that center. And so the wood is a metaphor for extension of life. Catie and I have been talking about when we can get over to see this thing, because I really want to experience it in person. And so I'm going to end with one of our biggest projects that is using wood. But I need to kind of give you some context and explanation for the project. This is an airport terminal. It's Portland, Oregon, PDX. It is, from a passenger experience rated airport, it typically gets the highest rating in the United States, years and years in a row. And so that's something they really, really wanted to focus on in this reconstruction and expansion of this existing core terminal. The original structure is from the 1950s. It's T-joist concrete. Incredibly strong, incredibly heavy, and now that they know they're in a Richter 9 subduction zone earthquake area, they also know that when that earthquake comes, that will pancake. And so that has to go away. And so what do you put over the top of that? What would you build as a new roof? And so part of the decision was to do one of the biggest mass timber structures in the United States, 440,000 square foot canopy. Or to kind of put that in other terms, 4 acres of wood overhead. Now, getting back to the passenger experience, one of the things the Port of Portland and the design team really want to focus on is passenger stress. And if you're going to have that conversation, one of the things you suddenly realize is there's not one kind of passenger, right? There are lots of different kinds of passengers who have very different experiences of an airport. And so here are 8 different passengers, and unfortunately this isn't coming through, but each one of these is a box of their experience: arrival, check-in, baggage, security, dwell time, experience at the gate. And where these different passengers are stressed, the box is gray. And you can kind of see where the box is gray, there's also hash lines underneath that. So to give you an example of that, so I have the business person and she travels a lot. So she takes a lift to the front door, easy. She has already checked in on her app on her phone. She has carry-on, so she doesn't have to check baggage. She has TSA pre-check, so she breezes through security. She grabs some food to take on the airplane, and she doesn't get stressed until she's sitting at the gate and suddenly realizes, I gotta get this email out before I get on the plane. Contrast that with the family traveling with young kids for the first time. Do we need to describe that, or right? Is that the craziness? Right? Exactly. Right. So arrival stress, check-in stress, baggage stress, going through security, getting all the. Do you still have your shoes when you come to the other end? Right. So stress, 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 stress. And then we get to the kids' play area before we go to the gate, and all of a sudden, we're better, right? So if you take all these different passengers and where they're stressed, and you translate that onto a floor plan as their route, you can then start seeing where the stress areas overlap. And 440,000 square feet, even though this is an enormous budget, we don't have the budget to do biophilic interventions everywhere, so let's do it where it's going to be most effective. And one of the ways to try to figure it out is, where do the biggest number of those hash lines intersect? And one of those is in this section right here the team calls the seam. That's a transition from where you're checking in and that towards a marketplace, and where you first see the queuing for security screening. And A, it's the traffic next down there, and B, you've got a lot of stressed folks all of a sudden when hopefully the queue's not too long, but this is a place where we really wanted to do an intervention. And so here's that space. What you're seeing overhead, it's a mass timber structure, but it's so high up there that you can see that it's wood, but you're not actually going to see the wood grain there. But in place of the wood grain, underneath the mass timber structure is this undercroft of Douglas fir slats that then create, and because of the changes and the curvature in this roof structure, you get this stunning collinear pattern overhead. And that you have that around the perimeter of this big skylight, and so now you create this really amazing dappled light statistical fractal on the floor as you walk through the space, and the space that you're walking through is planted in a planting that looks like is very similar to what you would find in a local forest. And so that's one of the interventions. And then here's right after you come through, this is the view you have after you come through security and you're in recomposure, which is also another stress place because, okay, do I have all my stuff? Can I get it back in the bag? And so you're sitting on this seat that actually has a tree growing out of it next to you. We were kind of hoping we might get bird song in there, but we haven't achieved that yet. And then you have this view out. Again, you're seeing the really strong collinear pattern of the Douglas fir slats overhead. So one of the questions we then get is, okay, so I'll use wood. And are there any kind of ground rules on that? And we've kind of come to several. There seems to be some decent evidence about how much wood in an environment to have the best effect, and it seems to be something around 40%. Which, when you think about the amount of surfaces in a room, actually isn't that huge a commitment. There is pretty clearly some rules about how you deal with the wood. If you stain it so dark that I can't see the grain, or you lacquer it, or you paint it and you can't see any of the grain, it might as well be plastic. And we're seeing a lot of plastic laminates that are getting very good at mimicking wood. And in environments where I can't have real wood, I'm sometimes okay with using that. And you're seeing porcelain tile now that's getting really good at mimicking wood. But neither of those materials, none of the synthetics, can actually do something that is unique to wood. And that's going back to wood was alive. And wood is made up of cells. And those cells are still there on the surface. And when light strikes that surface, it actually goes into the surface, and some of it reflects off the surface, and some of it reflects from underneath the surface. And so wood has a luminosity to it, has a light reflectance characteristics that's unique to wood. And where you can really see this, if you ever see like curly koa or iridescent wood, that's that effect happening in a really profound way. And that's something that I don't think we'll ever be able to really truly replicate with an artificial version of wood. So that's the nature of wood.
So I found Bill's presentation absolutely fascinating. I mean, obviously he's a dynamic presenter, and I love the whole idea of taking his biophilic patterns and looking at them through the lens of a very specific material.
Yes, I agree. It has a way of really illustrating the concepts that I find to be really helpful. What else stood out to you?
So the first thing that I love is this idea about aging and wear and tear in a building. One of the examples Bill gave was the Clota Spa on Kiowa Island, which hasn't been updated in about 18 years. You know, that's sort of unheard of in the hospitality industry. But then there is the more metaphorical example from the UK in this building, which was designed intentionally to age in order to show the extension of life for people dealing with serious health issues. I really thought like both of those examples were really beautiful.
And they were so thoughtful, and I completely agree. They were impactful in so many different ways to really learn and understand that. Also, this whole thing about real versus synthetic wood was really astonishing to me.
Yeah, let's get into that a bit because this came up at the summit a few times. The concept of real plants, natural materials, etc., versus their synthetic counterparts.
Yes, the example of the wood bed just completely jumped out at me. To recap, a bed made with a specific type of wood caused people to have marked positive cardiovascular responses compared to the people who slept in a bed nearly identical version, but it was made with plastic. That really was mind-blowing to me.
Yes, and going off of that, even though the linoleum flooring had gotten pretty sophisticated at mimicking wood, we still subconsciously respond to it differently. When we see real wood, our brain immediately recognizes it as something living and the way it reflects light differently.
Yes, it's just a completely different experience. So we definitely encourage you to head to our show notes to learn more about the biophilic response to wood.
And we'll be back in a couple weeks with a new episode.
Talk to you soon, Monica.
Bye, Jennifer.
Thanks so much for listening. And if you're enjoying the podcast, we would love for you to follow us on your favorite podcast app, give us a 5-star rating, and please leave us a review.
It really goes such a long way towards helping us reach a wider audience and sharing these amazing interviews and solutions with the world.
Absolutely. So thanks so much for following and reviewing the podcast, and we'll be back with another amazing interview in 2 weeks. You're now a part of the Biophilic movement.